In just a few days' time, the United States government will undergo a transfer of power. During this handoff, a new cabinet will be seated, a new Congress will get to work, and most importantly, a new president will be sworn in. But while these government transformations happen every few years, a few symbols of American democracy always endure. The presidential fleet of aircraft is one of them, with Air Force One now set to serve its 7th administration. And if all goes according to plan, this will be its last. Come 2029, the Air Force will refresh the presidential fleet with a pair of new aircraft. But what about the vice president's plane, Air Force Two? The Air Force Two platform is also growing old, but as far as we know, there are no plans to modernize it. And that's for good reason. Replacing Air Force Two is going to be a massive headache. Let me explain. Now, Air Force One and Air Force Two each have one major objective: keep the president and VP protected and safe during their travels. While most of us don't have access to that level of security, we can still take steps to protect ourselves, especially online. That's where Delete Me comes in, today's sponsor. Every single day, data brokers are collecting your personal information, like your name, address, phone number, and even details about your family. This data is then packaged up and sold to anyone who's willing to pay, many of whom have bad intentions. The risk of this ranges from getting a lot of annoying spam to actually getting your identity stolen. That's why I trust Delete Me. Their privacy experts comb through hundreds of data broker sites to find and remove my personal info. They are monitoring constantly to make sure that my data stays private. It's hands-free, simple, and gives me peace of mind. In today's climate, it's never been more important to protect your personal information. And because of that, Delete Me is offering my viewers 20% off when you use my code at checkout. Just check the link in the description to get started. Big thanks to Delete Me for sponsoring today's video, and now let's get back to it. Right off the bat, I want to clarify a common misconception. This plane is technically not Air Force One, and this plane is not Air Force Two. The terms Air Force One and Air Force Two are call signs used to distinguish any fixed-wing military jet that's carrying America's top brass. So if the president wanted to pilot an F-22, that Raptor would technically become Air Force One. Similarly, if the Veep hitched a ride on a B-2, that giant flying triangle would now become Air Force Two. The plane that we typically refer to as Air Force One is actually a VC-25A, though I'll still call it Air Force One for simplicity's sake. The VC-25 is a heavily modified 747-200, and for those familiar with the 747 family, you'll know the 200 variant is no spring chicken. As a matter of fact, Boeing stopped building the type in 1991, and only a handful are still in operation today. This has become a problem for the US Air Force, since finding spare parts is becoming harder and more expensive. So in 2015, the Air Force kicked off its replacement efforts. In that year, they agreed to purchase a pair of 747-8s to serve as the next presidential aircraft. This choice was actually pretty straightforward. The Dash 8 has a lot in common with the existing Air Force One fleet, while also being larger, more efficient, and easier to maintain. But while Air Force One now has a clear line of succession, Air Force Two does not. The Air Force Two fleet is made up of C-32As, which are modified Boeing 757s. Now these aircraft aren't exactly spring chickens either. They're now 26 years old. And if we use the Air Force One replacement timeline as a template, it could take up to 15 years for them to actually be phased out. So it's probably a good idea to start drawing up succession plans now. But as far as we know, there are no such plans in motion. And that's probably because there is no obvious way to replace them. You see, while Air Force Two is primarily used by the VP, it also serves a critical role for the president. Notably, it flies the president into much smaller airports that just can't handle the much larger Air Force One. For instance, when President Trump flew into Orange County back in 2020, an airport whose primary runway is just 5,700 feet, he had to use the vice president's plane. In short, Air Force Two has to be extremely versatile, and there's arguably no plane that's more versatile than the 757. Not only does it have fantastic range for its size, but it's largely considered to be overpowered, with many pilots comparing it to a sports car. Its high thrust-to-weight ratio means it can take off from very short runways, allowing it to visit even small regional airports. So when searching for a replacement, the Air Force is gonna look for a plane that can match its versatility. The problem is that there really aren't any. Boeing's closest modern-day offering, the 737 MAX 10, is almost certainly out of the running. It's about the same size as the 757, but it's a major step down in raw performance. Its max range is shorter, and it eats up much more runway during takeoff. And of course, there's the fact that the 737 MAX family has faced all sorts of safety questions. A much more suitable replacement for the 757 is the A321neo. Most airlines are actually already using this plane to replace their commercial 757s. And while its short field performance isn't quite as good as the 757s, its range is actually much better. Not only that, but other governments, like those of the UK and Germany, already use it to transport dignitaries. But thanks to geopolitics, the Neo will never actually be considered for the Air Force 2 job. That's because Boeing is just too important for the American economy. It's the country's biggest exporter and employs tens of thousands of US citizens. Meanwhile, Airbus is European-based, and having America's top executives fly on a European jet is just bad optics. Now, it is worth noting that Boeing's next plane is likely to be a 757 replacement and Neo competitor, but it probably won't hit the market until the mid to late 2030s. And the Air Force isn't likely to be an early adopter. They'll want to wait for the platform to reach maturity before entrusting it to transport high-ranking officials. As such, they probably wouldn't adopt it until the 2050s or even the 2060s. So we find ourselves at a bit of an impasse. The Air Force will want an American jet to serve as the next Air Force 2, but Boeing isn't going to have a suitable replacement for quite some time. So what's the Air Force to do? Well, they're gonna have to get creative. Remember, the reason that Air Force 1 is being replaced is due to maintenance concerns. And of all the components on a jetliner, the one that requires the most upkeep are the engines. The reason is pretty straightforward. A turbofan's internal parts are subject to high pressures and scorching temperatures. Meanwhile, the actual airframe doesn't take as much stress. That's especially true for Air Force 2, which doesn't fly nearly as often as a commercial jetliner. So perhaps, instead of replacing the entire plane, the Air Force can just retrofit them with new modern engines. Whoa, hold on. Back in 2019, I made a video that explicitly said that Boeing can't re-engine the 757. So did something change, or what's the deal here? Well, I stand by everything I said in that piece. It's still far too expensive for Boeing to re-engine the 757 for commercial purposes. But the US Air Force doesn't operate in the highly competitive airline market. Instead, they have innumerable resources, and can hand Boeing a blank check to re-engine Air Force 2 specifically for their needs. Boeing has actually already done something similar when it re-engined the Air Force's KC-135s. The KC-135 is a refueling tanker based on the 707, a plane that first flew in the 50s. The Air Force has hundreds of them in their arsenal, and in the early 2000s, they tasked Boeing and GE to upgrade their engines. They were ultimately retrofitted with the CFM56, the same type of engine found on the 737NG. And while the project was expensive, it extended their service life by decades. Re-engineering Air Force 2 could have a similar effect, extending the life of the airframe until a real successor is available. But this kind of project would still face challenges. Specifically, engine selection will be difficult. After all, Air Force 2 is powered by the Pratt & Whitney PW2000, which itself has no real replacement. The two modern-day engines that most closely match its performance are the LEAP-1A and GEnx, but neither are perfect fits. Of the two, I think it's way more likely that the Air Force tries to upscale the LEAP-1A rather than downscale the GEnx. The GE is just too big to fit under the 757's wing. But squeezing an extra 7,000 pounds of thrust out of the 1A, and then figuring out how to best integrate it into the airframe, could take several years. Luckily, the Air Force does have some time. While the PW2000 is an aging engine, it still has some life. Most notably, it powers the Air Force's fleet of C-17s, meaning there are still plenty of spare parts to go around. Ultimately, the path to replacing Air Force 2 is just kind of messy. There's no clear-cut solution, and there probably won't be one for decades. But the Air Force is gonna have to find a successor eventually, and they may have no choice but to re-engine the 757 as a stopgap. Sure, it would be costly, and the solution would be a temporary one, but it would result in a truly unique jet, giving the US Vice President arguably the coolest plane in the sky. Now, a lot of attention is paid to Air Force 1 and Air Force 2, but the US government is far from the only one that operates unique aircraft. From Germany's Merkel 1 to Russia's IL-96s to Algeria's A340-500s, heads of state get to fly on some really cool jets. And I'm curious, if you could pick one to call your own, which one would you choose? Let me know your answers in the comment section below. Oh, by the way, did you know that Boeing actually almost re-engined the 757 family back in the early 2000s? If they had done so, it would have made replacing Air Force 2 a whole lot easier. To learn more about that fascinating story, and why they ultimately decided against it, be sure to check out this video right here. Thank you so much to my patrons for helping to make this video possible. If you want to join the Patreon community and help this channel grow, go ahead and check out this link right here. And as always, if you learned something new today, leave a like and subscribe to keep learning. And until I see you again, don't forget to look up.